Welcome to the History Programme, a monthly series of programmes produced by the Franciscans of the Immaculate for Gate of Heaven Radio. In this series, we will be looking at events in history, famous people in history, including saints and blesseds, foundations of religious orders, and much more. In short, anything in history that has a Catholic perspective. Our objective will be to tell you the facts as recorded by history. We will not be entering into polemics nor aiming to generate any controversy. If we venture an opinion, we will say so. You are free to agree or disagree. This month's programme is entitled A Holy Jesuit of 20th Century Ireland, Father John Sullivan, S.J. On my visit to Ireland some years back, I called into the Jesuit Church in Gardiner St, in the city of Dublin, to visit the tomb of a holy Jesuit. My father is from Kildare and had often told me about this Jesuit priest, who had lived and worked in the Kildare area in the early part of the last century. He was famous for going around everywhere on a bike. He had the gift of healing. He was very good to the poor and is still fondly remembered in the area even now. Indeed, the husband of one of my father's cousins had received his first Holy Communion from the hands of this Jesuit. The Jesuit's name was Father John Sullivan, and he was declared venerable by Pope Francis last year, which means he practiced the virtues to a heroic degree. So who was Father John Sullivan? John Sullivan was born in Dublin City in 1861 to a Catholic mother and a Protestant father. His father would shortly afterwards become Solicitor General and eventually Lord Chancellor of Ireland. Remember, this was the time before Irish independence. His father was later made a baronet and so became Sir Edward Sullivan. The young John Sullivan grew up in Fitzwilliam Place, a plush Georgian terrace on Dublin's south side, the world of upstairs, downstairs. John's mother was a devout Catholic and was known as a friend and helper of the poor who lived in the nearby tenements. She had a great influence on young John. At that time, in a mixed marriage, sons were brought up in their father's religion and girls in their mother's religion. So John was brought up as a Protestant. No pressure was brought on John to convert. The nanny hired to look after the young John was a Catholic, and when taking him out for a walk, she always brought him into a Catholic church to say a prayer. At school, John excelled in the classics and became very proficient in Greek and Latin. He followed in his father's footsteps and studied law, going on to become a successful barrister. Although successful and well-dressed, he was shy and reserved. Like his mother, he became a great friend to the poor. On several occasions, he was happy to bail out street vendors when they got into trouble with the law. He was a keen walker and cyclist. Father Fergal McGrath, S.J., wrote a biography of Father John in the 1940s entitled Father John Sullivan, S.J. In his book, he writes that on one occasion, when John was travelling in Greece, he met the Greek Prime Minister, who remarked that this young Irishman not only could converse with them in modern Greek, but in ancient Greek as well, adding, which few of us can boast of being able to do. The barrister John stood out amongst his peers as a very virtuous man, and it was no surprise to anyone when it was announced that he had entered the Catholic Church. The momentous occasion took place in the Jesuit Church in Farm Street, London, in 1896. When news reached Dublin of John's conversion, one of his friends, a Presbyterian, asked another friend, a Protestant of a different denomination, "Did you hear that your friend John Sullivan has become a Catholic?" "Don't worry," replied the other good-humouredly. "John Sullivan would go to heaven even if he became a Presbyterian." No doubt the prayers and example of his mother played a powerful part in John's conversion. Even as a young barrister in the world, John was already gaining a reputation for holiness. Father McGrath's book tells us of a remark made at the time by one of John's friends, a justice. "Mr. John Sullivan is in the country. He has become quite a saint, and is an example to all people of religion and grace, in conduct and manners." It soon became apparent to many, especially members of religious orders with whom John had contact, that he had a vocation to the priesthood. Let us quote a couple of instances included in the book. He was the great friend of Mother Leonitia Callan, the then Mother Abbess of the Poor Clare Convent in Ballyjamestuff in County Cavan, which he visited frequently whilst staying in Park, Virginia, where his brother Sir William was resident magistrate for Cavan at the time. His visits are still recalled by members of that community. He told Mother Leonitia that he intended joining a religious order. She assured him that his vocation was for the Society of Jesus, and she was not mistaken, as the sequel showed. When there was no Mass in the parish church, owing to the absence of the local priests on retreat, he cycled to Mass in the convent every morning. He never used the prie-dieu left for him, but always knelt on the floor. His appearance, even at that time, was edifying and austere. One day at recreation, a sister remarked that Mr. Sullivan was very holy-looking. "Holy," exclaimed an old lay sister, herself most saintly. "Why, you could light a lamp before him." And we'll take another quote from the book. The sister secretary, afterwards Mother Stanislaus Joseph, superioress of the Mercy Convent in Lower Baggot Street, had been reared near the Jesuit novitiate at Tullabeg, and often spoke to Mr. Sullivan about it. He took a special interest in the nuns' school, where there were about 1,500 pupils, mostly children of workmen in Guinness's brewery. There was in the infant school a little girl named Annie, between 3 and 4 years old. Sister Stanislaus Joseph taught her to say, "God bless Mr. Sullivan and make him a holy Jesuit." Whenever he visited the school, this mite used to seize on any book that came handy, run up to him and pretend to read out from its pages this pious and unambiguous wish. He was amused and delighted, and used to say, "Say it again, Annie, say it again." It may be noted that in after years, when Annie came to be married, one of her wedding presents was a statue presented to her by Father John Sullivan, then rector of Rathfarnham Castle. John did indeed enter the Jesuits in 1900, when he was almost 40 years old. The best dressed young man around Dublin would soon become the worst dressed priest. After his novitiate in Tullabeg, County Offaly in Ireland, he was sent to Stonyhurst Jesuit Seminary in England for philosophy studies. John edified all during his stay there. One of his fellow students gives us his impressions of John. Mr. John Sullivan was constant in his visits to the Blessed Sacrament during the day. One day I came into the chapel unobserved and saw him kneeling in his characteristic attitude, slightly bent both from shoulders and hips, his hands barely resting on the bench, the head on one side, with eyes fixed on the tabernacle and the lips moving. For about 10 minutes I kept watching him, for it was a lesson to me. I wondered that any man could have such lively faith, and I recalled what a Dutch scholastic had said some months before. Mr. Sullivan actually talks to Jesus in this chapel. On leaving the seminary in 1904, I went to bid goodbye to the superior, Father Michael Marr, author of the well-known textbook on psychology. I thanked him for his kindness to me and told him how much I owed to the English province. He answered, "The seminary owes something to the Irish province. The Irish province sent us Mr. Sullivan. To have a man of God living in our midst is a special mark of God's favour to us." John finished his studies in Milltown Park, Dublin, and was ordained there on the 28th of July, 1907. Father John was assigned to Clongowes College, a Jesuit boarding school for boys in County Kildare in Ireland. He is remembered as a gentle teacher. He also took an interest in the sports games in the college. His words of consolation to a losing team would do well to be followed in our own win-at-all-costs culture. You win nothing unless you know how to lose. Father John's confession box was always busy, and even amongst the pupils he gained a reputation for being a saint. Towards the end of his life, the mother of one of his pupils wrote to the rector of the college. Although never having met him, I knew him well through the boys. I think the way in which they expressed themselves in their weekly letters home plainly tells what they thought of him. Father Sullivan, we call him the saint, ma'am, is dying. You will be sorry to hear. By the time this letter arrives, he will probably be in heaven. Father John took his final vows as a Jesuit on the 2nd of February 1915 in the college chapel. Father John's reputation as a holy priest soon spread out beyond the walls of the college. Before long, he was exercising a wonderful apostolate amongst the sick and suffering in the countryside around Clongowes. He became a well-known figure in the area, travelling around in a tattered coat and broken shoes, either by foot or on his bicycle. In this short programme, we can only give a few examples illustrating the special charismatic gifts of healing and prophecy granted to Father John. We should, of course, always bear in mind that it is God who works such miracles, and the individual person is merely the instrument. On the gift of healing, Father John cured people of many ailments, such as life-threatening pneumonia, danger of going blind, fractured limbs that would not set properly. Let us look at one example quoted in Father McGraw's book. In April 1918, Mr. W.T.M. Brown, a well-known veterinary surgeon living in Naas in County Kildare, was seriously ill with double pneumonia. A very dangerous complication had set in, and a Dublin specialist, who was called in by the local doctor, had tried various remedies to remove the complication without success. He told Mrs. Brown that he had had only one similar case, and that patient concerned had died. On hearing this, Mrs. Brown sent her husband's locum tenens in a car to fetch Father Sullivan. On his arrival, he went into the sick man's room, requested Mrs. Brown to leave them, knelt down beside the bed, and remained for a considerable time. He then left the room, and Mrs. Brown entered. She noticed at once that her husband was much calmer, and in a very short time the dangerous symptom disappeared. Meanwhile, in the confusion, Father Sullivan had slipped away before he could be noticed, and walked back 8 miles to Clongowes, though it was raining heavily. Mr. Brown rallied rapidly and made a complete recovery. On the gift of prophecy. In some cases, Father John saw that it was God's will that no cure would be forthcoming, and he helped people die a peaceful and sometimes pain-free death. To take one example quoted in the book, about 1919, a lady living in Dublin went to visit Father Sullivan at Rathfarnham Castle and told him that she was worried about her son, who was not settling down to any career. Father Sullivan expressed interest in the boy, but no opportunity occurred to bring them together. In 1923, the boy, then aged 21, fell dangerously ill, and on his removal to hospital was found to be suffering from peritonitis. Quite spontaneously, he asked his mother if it were not true that Father Sullivan worked cures, and demanded that he should be sent for. Father Sullivan arrived at 7 a.m. When he entered the room, the young man said, "Father, won't you cure me?" Father Sullivan replied, "No, son, it is better to go to heaven." The young man showed no dissatisfaction and died a holy death after 10 days of suffering. His father felt his loss keenly, and in his presence the mother asked Father Sullivan why God had permitted such a thing. Father Sullivan replied, "This boy would have had to bear a cross he would not have been able for." The mother used frequently to ask Father Sullivan to say Mass for the repose of the soul of her son, but after a couple of years he refused to do so any more. St. Maximilian Mary Kolbe once remarked that the 6 friars do the most work. Father John was of the same mind. Let us take a couple of examples quoted in Father McGraw's book. We had the privilege of having Father Sullivan here, the Sacred Heart Convent in County Armagh, several times for retreats. Invariably, a postcard would arrive on the day before, stating that he would be with us at such an hour in the evening, and that he needed no car to meet him at the station, and would only require a cup of weak tea, having had his dinner before starting. His first question on arriving was, "Have you any sick in the house?" And once, when the answer was, "Thank God the infirmaries are empty," he remonstrated almost indignantly, "Don't say thank God. The sick are a blessing in the house." He was indeed devoted to them, and during his stay in the convent, he visited them every day. The Little Sisters of the Poor have at Kilmainham in the suburbs of Dublin a well-known home for aged men and women, St. Patrick's House, sadly now since closed. An old woman died there who had been an inmate for many years, and on the morning of the funeral, the sisters saw a very shabbily dressed priest coming into the church and kneeling down at the Mass. They were very curious to know who he was and afterwards asked his name. He told them that he was Father John Sullivan and that the old woman had been his nurse when he was a child. He added that, when taking him out for a walk, she always brought him into a Catholic church to say a prayer, and that this had no doubt played a part in his conversion. Father John was very ascetic in all things, especially in his eating. Let us take a look at some examples of this quoted in Father McGraw's book. Once, when the sister who attended him delivered a message, he presented a crucifix for her to kiss, telling her that he was very fond of it. This sister's constant fear was that he would starve, as, except for his meagre breakfast, the only food which he ate during the 8 days was a tablespoonful of rice and half a cup of tea each day. On some days he took less rice and no tea. On another occasion he was asked by a sister in charge of his meals, "But Father, you'll never be able to keep yourself up on that." "That's just it," he replied. "I want to keep myself down." A woman once replied to a nursing sister who had asked her why she sought out Father John during her illness. "He is quite an exception. He is very hard on himself. You have to be hard on yourself to work miracles, and he does it." We do not have much in the way of writings left by Father John. However, he devoted much of his time to the giving of retreats to religious communities around Ireland, and so we must rely on notes taken by some of these retreatants. One retreatant remarked that he must have made a promise never to spend a day without speaking about Our Lady, for every day after the last instruction he gave us the story of a conversion or a special favour granted through her intercession. Let us read a short extract from these notes. Do you want to know how to pray? Listen to the salutation of an angel, the response of God's own mother, or the greetings of Elizabeth. You say that you cannot make a meditation. How could Mary tell St. Luke the great things he related? Because she kept all these words, pondering them in her heart. Ponder all these words in your own heart with her. You too will learn how to meditate. Do you want to know how to make your thanksgiving after Holy Communion? Kneel at Mary's feet whilst she sings her thanksgiving after the first Holy Communion. Father John passed away on the night of the 19th of February 1933, after receiving the last rites of the Church. His brother, Sir William Sullivan, who had arrived from England on the ferry not long before, was at his bedside. The surgeon who had attended Father John was one of his former pupils. It is fitting to close with the words spoken by the surgeon. I am left, he wrote afterwards, with a very vivid memory of his supreme courage and fortitude when suffering the shocking pain which he must have had in his last illness. The cause of his death was mesenteric thrombosis, causing gangrene of an extensive length of his small intestine. I think it would be very hard for those who have not had a similar type of experience to imagine the appalling intensity of the pain that he had to endure. After his operation, he was cheerfulness itself. He was extraordinarily grateful for what poor service I had been able to give him, and was humorous and confident. His morale was so good that I cheated myself, hoping against hope that he would survive. This episode of the History Programme was researched and presented by Fra Solanus for Gate of Heaven Radio. We hope you have enjoyed it and will join us again next month for another episode of the History Programme. For more information on Father John Sullivan, there is a website, www.fatherjohnsullivan.ie. That's www.forjohnsullivan.ie. Ave Maria.